Good evening, everyone. On behalf of NYSAFLT's Professional Development Committee, let me welcome you to NYSAFLT's sixth and final professional webinar for educators for the 2014-2015 school year. This evening's webinar is entitled Establishing Clear Learning Targets for Ourselves and Our Students. My name is Ken Hughes, and I will be moderating this evening's webinar, which comes to you today through the generous sponsorship of the New York State Language Regional Bilingual Education Resource Network at NYU. The purpose of this organization is to provide ongoing support to educators of English language learners in districts and schools statewide. NYSAFLT would like to take this opportunity to thank them for their very generous support of our endeavors. Please note that the audio and video of this webinar will be recorded, and I will provide you with details about how you can access the on-demand recording at the end of the webinar. This webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour with approximately 45 to 50 minutes devoted to the presenter. The remaining time will serve as a question and answer with the presenter to answer your questions. If you'd like to ask a question of the presenter during the presentation, please use the question or chat feature in the GoToWebinar control panel on the side of your screen and type in your questions. As moderator, I will organize these questions and share them with the presenter at the end of the presentation. As a registered live participant, you will receive a PDF certificate of attendance stating that you signed up and logged in to this webinar. NYSAFLT does not and cannot guarantee any professional development credit for this webinar. If you are watching this video on demand, NYSAFLT is unable to grant you a certificate of attendance. All participants are encouraged to work with their immediate supervisor to determine how best to receive credit for this professional development. In the event of technical difficulties, please remain connected to the webinar as you are able. NYSAFLT will contact you directly if the problem cannot be resolved. And now, please let me take this opportunity to introduce you to Paul Sandrock. Paul Sandrock, Director of Education at the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, or as we all know, ACTFL, directs this national organization's professional development and initiatives around standards, curriculum, instruction, and performance assessment. Previously, Paul was Assistant Director of Content and Learning at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, coordinating the areas of English language arts, mathematics, international education, and world languages. He earlier served as the Department of Public Instruction statewide consultant for world languages for the state of Wisconsin. And Paul taught Spanish for 16 years in middle school and high school and authored The Keys to Assessing Language Performance and Planning Curriculum for Learning World Languages. Paul previously served ACTFL as a board member and president and received ACTFL's Florence Steiner Award for Leadership in Foreign Language Education, K through 12. It is my pleasure to introduce to you this evening's presenter and good friend, Paul Sandrock. Paul, good evening. How are you?
Well, thank you. While we're making that switch, thank you so very much for the opportunity to share this conversation with all of the wonderful teachers of New York. And congratulations to your amazing organization, NYSAFLT. You do wonderful work, and I appreciate being a part of the presentation at this point. Something about the title must have drawn you into the conversation this evening about clear learning targets. And I put them in the title that it's both for us and for our learners. And as we start to go through how we identify learning targets, establish and use them, keep both lenses in mind as well. How does it improve and focus our instruction? And also, how does it help our learners have a sense of what is this mysterious thing we call language learning? And how do I know I'm making progress? What I'd like to model, and if you've been able to download the handout, you will see on the cover of it the learning targets for the day. And I want to model that whole idea of learning targets by using the format of I can or can do statements. So I think by the end of 1 hour together, we are all going to be able to say, you know, I think I can describe some key characteristics for moving to the next higher level of performance, specifically the ones you see here, novice to intermediate, intermediate toward advanced. I think you're going to get a good sense of how to adapt the NYSAFLT ACTFL can-do statements to focus expectations for performance tasks, again, both for ourselves as we design those tasks and for our learners as they undertake those tasks. Also, I think you're going to be able to say, I can design some effective learning experiences and assessments, and my examples are going to be more in the interpersonal and presentational modes. And I think also you're going to be able to say, I can identify some ways to shift to more authentic resources, evidence, audiences, and motivation. That last can-do statement is what I'd like you to sort of keep in the back of your mind, or as the lens through which you are listening and viewing all of the resources throughout the evening, as you think about how am I making that shift, as I think about pushing performance to the next level, adapting can-do statements, and designing effective learning experiences and assessments. So with that in mind, let's jump right into that backward design process and think about these three key components. First of all, trying to identify our desired results by asking ourselves, really, what are the goals? What are the goals for this unit that I'm teaching? What are the goals for the larger program in which I'm involved? Our learners are asking those questions. We should ask ourselves those questions as the teachers, the leaders, the coaches. Next, we need to determine, well, what's the acceptable evidence that I ever reached that goal? How will I know? How will my learners know we got there? And then after I've done that preliminary work, now I am ready to plan those learning experiences by asking, gosh, what's it going to take to get there? What do I do day by day as I plan those learning experiences instruction? And obviously, if I've plotted my course backwards this way, I'm much more likely to actually be able to go reverse those arrows and go back up and actually hit my goal, rather than hoping for the best just because I planned a lot of good things. So let's dive right in, and I want to put us in a frame of mind about how we normally think about learning targets. We're given a topic such as you see here. You're assigned to teach a unit on school and education. I'm sure we all have taught something along these lines. Maybe it was the chapter of a textbook. Maybe it was a curriculum title. Somehow this is what I'm assigned to teach next. And I have to start to think about, gosh, what do I teach? What am I going to teach? And I want you mentally right now to start generating that list. Whether you're teaching at a beginning level, an intermediate level, a more advanced level, if you were to start to assign, if you were assigned to teach this unit and you had to start your planning, what kinds of things would come to mind? And as you're having that thought about what you teach, I want to share with you a list and compare the thoughts that were starting to form in your head with this particular list, which surfaced with a group I actually had this morning who generated a list very similar to this. And I was just amazed at the similarity, that it is often about vocabulary. It might be something like telling time. It might be a language function like how you ask a question. Notice these framed around school and education. It might be some cultural elements, differences in the system, number grades versus letter grades, or cultural behaviors. How do I greet the teacher at the start of the class? The problem I always had when I was engaged in doing my planning, and I could easily generate this kind of a list. My problem was not how to start or how to keep it going for a long time. My problem was, when do I stop? When have I reached my destination? Usually it was, when are my students exhausted? And when has the learning stopped? Well, that's not a good way to determine where I have met my goals, and instead of feeling simply that I've taught a lot of things. So let's think about a different way, and this is where I want you to start putting on that lens of how do we make it authentic? So school and education, I have had to use that list that we just saw of vocabulary, of language functions, of cultural elements, when my principal came to me and said, guess what? We have a student coming from Guatemala. He is coming in 2 weeks. He's going to be here for 1 year. His parents and his child are really nervous. They are scared that this child is not going to be ready or welcomed in the school. Could you think about what you could do with your students these 2 weeks before the student arrives to help him feel comfortable spending a year on our campus? Could you collaborate with your students? I had beginning language students at the time, and I really scrambled to think about what can they do? What can they do? They can't say much. What could they do? So think about that same list we just had and how suddenly, as you're thinking about some real things that you could do that would help the student feel comfortable, notice how it generates a very different kind of list. And I encourage you to go through a similar process with other topics that are the units you've been assigned. So this one for school and education, making it simply this kind of authentic challenge of let's get the student ready to spend a year on campus. You've had about a minute now to think of a lot of things you could do with your learners. Here is a list generated again as I worked with some teachers recently, and they said, oh, this is what I would do. This is something I could do. This is what we could do even with our most novice learners. And as I look at each one of these tasks, they are things that novice could do. What's interesting is that you see I've put them into 3 columns, interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational, because we are familiar with those modes, and I want evidence of every single mode. What was most interesting is that when I put this question out to the teachers, we were not even talking about modes. We didn't even mention the word standards or proficiency. We simply said, what could we do? They generated, within about 2 minutes, this wonderful list of things. They were getting excited. They were saying, oh, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this. And suddenly, as we looked at it, we said, well, look, we have a wonderful list of interpersonal things that we might practice, get ready for. The exchanging of emails they put in the interpersonal column because they weren't editing them. They were simply saying, just quick, send the message in and relate those questions that we might have about this student's school and what he's worried about might be a cultural difference. And notice the kinds of research that even novice level learners could do in that interpretive mode. Rather than telling them what's the same or different between schools, they did the research about it. Find out, research, go to websites. And even at a novice level, they were pulling out some very simple language that gave them a wonderful thing to reflect on about how is this the same or different from your own school. And I can say that this even included some teachers of Chinese who normally are, you know, the challenge is, well, our students can't read anything. However, they recognize the words about school that you've been teaching them. They recognize the words about classes and time and schedules and the places in a school. So they were then ready also to do the presentational tasks that you see here. I know you've been looking at this, but I've also provided it for you if you're opening your handout. It's at the bottom of page 2, or it may have printed out by going on to the next page, bleeding over onto page 3. So it's either at the bottom of page 2 or at the top of page 3. So you do have this list to reflect on. We're going to come back to it a little bit later, but I wanted you to know how it got generated and to experience how authentic motivation changed completely the way that the unit was going to proceed. And what I want to think about now as I think about what those desired results, those learning targets in backward design, that's where I need to start. There are 2 key components. Now, in this exercise, we generated very quickly the what. What we haven't really looked at yet is the how well piece. And so the standards give me a good way of making sure that I have given good attention to the full breadth and depth of the what. And now I also want to engage in thinking through, and how good is good enough? How am I making sure that my learners are making that continuous progress through the novice, into the intermediate, through the advanced, towards the advanced? And you'll notice one of the things I'm going to talk about later is when you look at that pyramid and the subtle shading that's there, when they're in the novice level, in order to get them to the intermediate level, it isn't automatic like, oh, you're at the end of your 2nd year, you're automatically an intermediate level kid. It starts in the novice level because I treat you more and more like an intermediate and help you act like an intermediate and deliver that kind of language even though you can't yet sustain it on your own. A novice mid is already showing some intermediateness. A novice high is showing a lot of intermediateness. And when they can sustain it on their own, so that's when I have to let go and not do all the work for them, now they are at that intermediate low level. So keep some of those ideas in mind. And I hope you are all aware that the Standards Collaborative Board, those 18 organizations that are in charge of developing and maintaining our national standards, have just come out with a revised, refreshed version. It is available through our ACTFL.org store. And that, as I said again, is the what. And you'll notice that the logo is a little bit different. Really, it's showing how all of those 5 C's contribute towards that interculturality, that confluence of communication and culture skill, making me that global citizen you see in the middle there of the logo. What I want to just show you very quickly is the important shift in the standards, because there has been an important shift. And since we're talking about learning targets, I've highlighted the verbs, because the verbs, I think, tell the story. It used to say engage in a conversation, and we can engage in conversations and hardly ever really exchange much information. We can hear 2 reports back and forth, and just because we're looking at each other, call it engaging in a conversation. The refreshed standard gets pretty explicit and says, your task better make sure that the learners have to interact and negotiate meaning as they share their information, reactions, feelings, and opinions. They have to interact and negotiate meaning. That means the answer is not always predictable. The question that I'm going to use as a follow-up is not always predictable. It might be a memorized question, but I've never exactly put it after this first question before. I'm now acting more like an intermediate instead of just a novice, because my learning target says I have to interact and negotiate meaning. In the interpretive mode, again, 2 key verbs, understand and interpret. That's get the meaning. But the real deeper interpretive is in the new verb added, analyze. Analyze. And thinking of that visual literacy as important as well. Not just hearing and reading, but also viewing on a variety of topics. That's an important addition, and sometimes the way that we set up the questions we ask, or the graphic organizers that we set up, that is how we will help our even most novice learners do that analyze. In the presentational mode, you'll see that the challenge was there was only 1 verb in the entire standard before, present, which usually is one of us or the student standing in front of the entire class very nervously. Instead, now look at the richness of literacy that is embedded in the refreshed standards, presenting information, concepts, ideas, but for a purpose: inform, explain, persuade, and narrate. That's not always done just by presenting in front of a class. It may be done through a blog, through a wiki. It may be done through an advertising campaign. It may be done through a poster I'm putting up around my school. There are a variety of ways that we can inform, explain, persuade, and narrate. We want to keep the variety in mind. I'm going to quickly just go through the other 4 C's, with the main message I want you to take away being, notice how the words use the language are embedded throughout the remaining 4 C's. This is not an opportunity, oh, let's just do this in English and get it out of the way. It's really to use the language, because what I'm doing is something that I can do with the language in the culture. Investigate, like looking at those school websites. Explain, to say, oh, this is what they do in China in their school. This is how many subjects they have to take. I investigated it, I'm explaining it. I can do that in simple novice language and reflect on it. I can make the comparison. In China, most students study, in my school, most students study. There I am reflecting on a cultural product and the perspective, slightly the perspective behind it. Notice how the word use the language is there with connections, how it is there with comparisons, how it is there with communities. Use the language, use the language, use the language is the mantra that we want to take with our understanding of the standards. What the refreshed standards have done, again, I'm presenting all of this as a way to help us know that there is help as we try to establish our learning targets and what we want to consider as we set our learning targets. So the standards start out with what's familiar, the 5 C goal areas, the content standard. Now you've seen some of the refreshed language. What's really helpful now as I set learning targets is having embedded an answer to how well. Instead of saying by grade 4, by grade 8, by grade 12, which they used to say, or saying it has to be at a certain level, level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now it gets right down to business and says, well, am I working towards novice, to the higher level of novice? Am I working into intermediate? Am I working toward advanced? Here my example is pulling from that interpersonal communication mode. Well, what happens in the intermediate range? With that at the top as my performance descriptor, now those can-do statements, that wonderful document that came from the collaboration of NYSAFLT, the state supervisors, and NYSAFLT, is embedded as the best way to say, well, what are those indicators of performance? So there's the global statement from the can-do statements and the sample indicators right out of the can-do statements, giving me a wonderful guideline as I try to set up learning targets. They're at that generic enough language, but not so generic as to be not useful. It's generic enough that I can see that I need to get more than 1 unit's worth of evidence on these particular targets, but I know how I'm going to practice having simple conversations on a number of everyday topics. I'm going to make sure that in my units they use language to meet their basic needs in familiar situations. And that's where I make them contextualized into each particular unit. And the final piece of the standards then are the progress indicators, again linked to the range of performance. So the novice range, still in that interpersonal communication, still working towards the idea of applying it and setting my learning target. Here's the kind of evidence that I will collect at each range of communication. This is what's built into the standards, so I encourage you to access that document and look at how it will help you as you're doing your unit design, your curriculum work, your mapping of the learning targets across your program. The other language-specific standards have not yet all been updated. Hindi is very much in line with the World Readiness Standards because they were simultaneously developed and they are new. The other 13 are on their own timetable to be updated. As you purchase the standards and you add on one or all of the languages, they are all available electronically, and so when they are refreshed, you will have instant access to that refreshed version. So you don't need to wait and buy it later. You can get it now, and you will always have access then to the refreshed version of the language-specific standards themselves. So I want to bring that how and how well conversation again back to how is this helping me as I design that unit around school and education? What am I gonna do? Well, we know that the larger how well comes from those proficiency guidelines, the inverted pyramid that's on the cover of the handout you have downloaded. But those proficiency guidelines are intended for academic testing, more beyond my K-12 situation, or for government testing when I want these kinds of jobs. These are pretty high stakes jobs, and obviously these are high stakes assessments, or for a job in a business such as any of these. All of these, the universities, the government agencies, the commercial enterprises, come to ACTFL and they ask, well, given these requirements of the job, what should be the minimum level of proficiency that someone should have in order to be hired? This next chart shows you at the highest level, so working from distinguished backwards to advanced mid, the corresponding positions, professions, that through that analysis have been identified as, starting at the bottom, if I want to be a fraud specialist, a court stenographer, a technical service agent, I better be at least at the advanced mid level because of the kinds of language functions I have to use in my day-to-day work. What I also want you to notice as you're looking at this list is the far right column. Well, typically, what does it take to get there? Notice there's not a lot of educational intervention here. To get to these higher levels, it's much more about my experience, my use of language in a professional context. It's a lot of time immersed in the country, in the culture, in the work environment. So let's go to the next lower chunk. So underneath advanced mid, I see on the far right, this is what education does influence. Through that novice level, what it takes to get through the novice level, through the intermediate levels, into that advanced low level. And we are seeing increasingly K-12 programs, not immersion programs, but K-12 programs, when they are really attentive to the language functions it takes to move from novice into intermediate and intermediate into advanced, that they are getting their students up to that advanced low level. So I encourage you to think about how we can really use this information as we work on our learning targets and always be looking ahead to that next level. So let me just summarize this piece, which you will find summarized at the top of page 2 in your handout, that performance takes place in my classroom. It's in an instructional setting. It's like we kind of intervene as educators. What I have to make sure is that I'm getting them ready and I'm pointing toward the world of proficiency, because that's out in the real world, on the streets of Beijing, in that market in Guatemala, or in some professional setting where I need to use my language. So I'm always thinking, how is what I'm doing in my performance world, in my classroom, how are my learning targets preparing my learners for that world of proficiency that we just saw and we understand a little bit better, and it's high stakes. So what you see at the top of page 2 is the comparison and some of the changes. I work on a lot of learning, a lot of practicing in my instructional setting. It's spontaneous and it's unrehearsed in the world of proficiency. So I can benefit and boost performance higher because I stay within a context. I stay on topic for the course of an entire unit. It becomes more and more familiar. Same with my assessment now is going to be dependent on my curriculum. Whereas any proficiency assessment doesn't care how you learned, where, when, native speaker or not. It's independent of all of that. So my assessment is going to be based on what was taught, what was practiced, versus only looking at the actual proficiency guidelines. So as you're thinking about, how do I influence the world of performance so that it reflects the world of proficiency? To me, it's all about those learning experiences, that bridge that I create through my learning experiences by being clear on my learning targets so that they do reflect a purposeful, meaningful use of language. So again, a question I would like you to just reflect on a moment, and then I'm going to share a few ideas around that question. What are some things you are already doing that are creating those authentic learning experiences that bridge from the world of performance to the world of proficiency? What are some of those things? I know you're getting them in your heads already. So let me share a few ideas, and anytime you have some questions, be sure you type them in, and Ken's going to moderate and send them my way when we take some of those pause points. So the world of performance, working towards proficiency, here are 3 key things that I think really help bridge that world. Using language through simulations of real-life activities. So instead of just learning a lot of school vocabulary, thinking about how would I use it if I had to introduce my school to someone who was really from that country, from that culture. Using authentic resources, because we know that's one of the most scary things that our learners experience when they are suddenly immersed in country or in the culture, in an authentic resource, is that ability to just push aside the things that are not important and focus on what's the task here. Don't worry about all the stuff that I don't need to know. Can I pull out what I do need to know? Is it an answer to a question? Is it to read a schedule? Is it to make a comparison of my life and the life of the student in France? Whatever it is, the better I can get at sorting through all that's there and focusing on what's my task, I am not going to be floored by those or overcome by those authentic resources. I'm going to be able to go in and do what I know I can get from them. And then creating situations where our learners have to take more responsibility, where they ask the questions and they don't already know the answer. Because now they're really intrigued and they're really going to follow up. They're not just going to let the person say anything. They're going to say, well, no, I asked you this question, and not you're answering a different question. Oh, that's part of the answer, but could you tell me more? Could you tell me this? They're going to naturally want to dig a little deeper when the situation is set up that they are the ones asking the questions and they're not predictable. So these are some of the key shifts, again, I think you've been hearing around making sure that our learning experiences are more authentic in all of these ways. And I think a lot of it taps that last one, that our motivation of our learners becomes more authentic. It's not just I'm trying to please the teacher, I'm doing it for him or her, you're the only audience. It's like, I'm doing this because it's engaging for me. It's something that I want as a lifelong goal, to be able to use the language in this authentic way. As we think then about, well, what are the tools I can use to help bridge from performance towards proficiency, I encourage you to download the can-do statements. And on page, it should be page 4, it might have jumped to page 5 of your handout, are all of the various resources, including this one. So you don't need to copy down the screen link right now. It's right there in your handout. It's a very important document, and I just want to help you understand how it bridges proficiency into performance. Because it started with the proficiency guidelines, and instead of trying to use that really test spec type of language that's in the proficiency guidelines, to pull out some of the key elements related to that mode. So this is interpersonal speaking. I didn't pull out the pieces that would be more presentational speaking. And they were pulled into a global benchmark of performance, now in friendly student terms of I can do these things. It's very powerful for students to see that. What's even more powerful is when you put them in this whole continuum, and you see what I was just highlighting is that intermediate low one right at the top there, and how it is part of a whole continuum from novice low all the way to advanced, and it even goes on all the way to that distinguished level, as well as in the other modes, presentational, speaking and writing, and also interpretive, reading and listening. That global benchmark becomes like a lighthouse that I constantly keep my focus on, and there it is at the top of the details within the document. So what you see in the green there at the top is exactly what you saw on that larger chart, but now I want to know, how am I going to get there? That's a pretty huge learning target. I'm going to be focusing on that all of probably my second year. I'm trying to get you towards intermediate low. Well, here are three sub-elements, these bold-faced statements, that are now actually embedded in the refreshed standards. You saw those. And they give me a variety of things, again, that I need to work on unit after unit. The next are simply examples of what that might look like in a variety of units, in a variety of content areas. And the important thing is not to say, oh, well, I don't teach hobbies and interests. I guess I'm never going to be able to check off that box. That's why there's a blank one. The important thing is to say, oh, okay, I'm doing this, but in a different context, in a different unit. How would I adapt this can-do statement to be one that would be pertinent to the particular content that I am using? It might be in an immersion school you are teaching, and you want to change these and adapt to the life cycle of a butterfly. I'm not talking about a family. I'm talking about the life cycle of a butterfly instead, and having those asking and answering of simple questions on that particular topic. I want to go back to, and as you find again that list that we saw at the beginning that had been generated about what we would do to help that student adjust to spending a year on campus. So back on page 2, possibly 3 in your handout. What I did is simply looked at those can-do statements as I downloaded them in the interpersonal to say, well, I was targeting that novice range, trying to push students to higher levels in novice. Were my tasks appropriate? And you can see my analysis of looking at each one of these tasks that were just randomly generated to say, is that appropriate to use in this unit? Is this where my learners are? Is this where I'm trying to push them to be? And you can see my summary there of novice mid for number 4, novice mid for number 3, novice high for number 2, and intermediate low for number 1. What you see in the statement after that, IL, NH, NM, are those bold-faced statements. So I'm saying, wow, I have real evidence in the tasks I'm doing in my unit that I can see I'm moving my students just by the tasks that I'm asking them to do to move from novice mid to novice high to try to be more like an intermediate low. They may not be completely successful, and I may need to intervene more, so they may not really end up at the end of the unit at intermediate low. But I know that if I'm trying to work towards that by the end of my course of this particular year, that I am doing the right things in this unit to help move them along and not doing the opposite, which is often keeping them down at that mid-novice level by asking them to do such too simple things, things that are overly simple for them. So here's how, again, I can analyze my learning targets, analyze my tasks, and make sure that, that's why we're doing these things. In fact, increasingly, I've been in classrooms where, and let me show you the interpretive one, where the students answer the question. When they raise their hand and they say, why are we doing this? Instead of the teacher looking pained like I always did, I've seen students actually turn around and say, well, like that novice high thing we're supposed to do about understanding short, simple messages and familiar topics, that can-do statements on the wall there, that's why we're doing this, so we'll be able to do that better when we get to the end of unit. It's like, I was floored. They were actually talking the language. This is how these kind of learning targets become something that are very useful to our students as well as to us. So you can see, again, same analysis I did here for the interpretive tasks, and here it is for the presentational tasks. So I have novice mid, novice high, intermediate low all throughout. So actually it was pretty good that these were some good tasks that I could use in this unit to help move my learners along. This again, here I pulled some key things that I need to work on in all of my units and across my entire program. One of the key things to move along in interpersonal is asking and responding to questions. And I just pulled the low and the high of novice and intermediate and the low of advanced so you can see how it builds up level to level. And now I can start to differentiate within my class and say, you know, you should really be acting more like intermediate. You should be asking not just simple memorized questions. You should be starting to ask some more of those who, what, when, why questions, where students have to respond with more details. That would be showing that you're starting to act more like an intermediate. Do you think you can do that? And challenge those students who are ready for that to move up to that level. Here also in the presentational, one of the key things is how do I organize my presentational tasks rather than just randomly write out a bunch of stuff. And you can see again as I move through the novice low and high, intermediate low, high to the advanced low, that increase in what I need to do, that increasing awareness of planning, organizing, drafting, revising, summarizing, doing the research to support it, not just staying at novice and just giving back a bunch of lists, a bunch of short reactions. Really thinking through. This is guiding their performance to higher levels in presentational. I want to just show how some of these learning targets have played out also with some different state examples. From Texas, what they did in their soon-to-be approved state standards is to look at each level as a range. And notice as you go from level 1 on the right to level 2 on the left, there's an overlap. So it isn't that I'm just jumping right away to high to that novice high level and stopping. It's like, well, I'll probably still be in the novice high level for a lot of level 2, and I try to push into intermediate low. And then intermediate low, intermediate mid, high, and advanced low. And they've looked carefully at how might that play out with different languages that may take different speed in different modes, which is also the model I want to show you from North Carolina. Here is that full chart of the can-do statements again. You see the interpretive at the top, interpersonal is the middle, and the bottom two are the presentational. And here is how they started to set some learning targets at the state level around, well, okay, high school level 2, an alphabetic language, kind of similar in some ways to English. Here is at the end of level 2 where I should be. And notice one of the hardest skills is presentational speaking, because I had to think and organize and deliver and not just read a presentation. Comparing that to high school level 2 in a language like Mandarin Chinese, look what happened. It's saying, you know, that writing system does get in the way, and I can't rely on cognate, so sometimes listening gets in the way. But for interpersonal, you should be able to get over that, and you're held at the same level. I think these are some really thoughtful messages around how to set some learning targets. Here's another example. Heritage speakers at level 1. This is higher expectation in what they bring to the table, what they bring to that level 1 heritage speaker course. It's a strong listening and speaking component developed over time in their home or their community. But notice some of those literacy skills, the reading, the spoken presentation, the writing are not as strong. Compared to now an alphabetic language like Spanish, high school level 4, non-heritage students, now you should be at that intermediate level, but still a little bit lag behind in that that presentational speaking. And one last example at the elementary level, here was after 90 minutes of instruction a week, after 5 years, elementary FLES, good target to get you to that intermediate low level. Consciously working on that as a learning target, but understanding and reading and writing, you were also simultaneously developing literacy in your first language is not quite as strong, so they're not quite as strong. Compared to an immersion program, definitely should all be at the intermediate level because there was more attention to that literacy simultaneously being developed all the way through. I just find these as really powerful and thoughtful ways to think about using these carefully, looking at it mode by mode, looking at the kind of program, the kind of learner I have, and using that to set learning targets. So I wanted to bring that to our conversation tonight. So as you reflect on these can-do statements, I'm sure you're thinking about all of these examples, excuse me, and how you might use them to do some setting of learning targets, designing tasks, guiding the implementation of a unit. not hearing any questions at this point, let me continue on, and I'm going to encourage you to move then on to page 3, or again, some of you may have bled over onto page 4 of your handout, where we're going to explore that middle area of how do I determine acceptable evidence? How do I know they've reached the goals? And now I'm thinking more along the how well part of the spectrum, not the what part of the spectrum. So right from our proficiency guidelines website, you can look at examples in a variety of languages. I pulled one from English, so this was an English language learner. Given the task, if I were setting up this task of presentational writing, I would have set it up that here is a 1-minute video clip from the concert. Here is the poster for the concert. Here is a ticket for the concert. Look at these artifacts, and please write a review. Here is the result of an on-demand writing, presentational writing, what the person came up with. As you're reading through it, as I've been talking, I know you've been doing that, I would like you to think about what are the things that you think are impressive, the things that tell you, I don't think this is the novice level. And I've done some of that thinking already for you, and here are the things that jumped out at me. So as you're looking at that chart that says, what is the overarching proficiency goal for my learners? And I see it says interpretive interpersonal presentational at the top in your handout. And I'm looking, I already encourage you to skip past the novice level, clearly not writing in words or lists. At the intermediate and advanced levels, I'm looking at the criteria that are there, and I see examples here that say it is at the advanced level. It's those words that connect the meaning and help the reader follow through. As usual, furthermore, there is not doubt. Personally, those are good markers. Well, you know what? I could teach some of those to my novice kids. They would use them in a novice way, probably when reminded, but they would start to get a sense, even at the novice level with their memorized language, that's what it takes to get to the higher level. Start to connect ideas together. Start to guide your reader along. And that's how, again, knowing the full set of learning targets and what's coming next down the road, I can start to prepare my learners, even at that novice level, to be ready for those learning targets that they're going to be held accountable for later on. So let's compare this advanced level writing, which really is a whole paragraph of thought. It has all that cohesion, a lot of amazing description. In the middle there where it says the adrenaline of the fans was high, I know my novice learners would have said, it was an exciting concert. The singer sang good. So here is a classic intermediate. And I say classic because as you're looking at the list on your handout, it says control sentences or series of sentences. You say, well, it looks like a paragraph to me. What I'm going to do is simply put a return after each one of the periods. And now you can see that this is merely a string of sentences. There's nothing at all connecting one sentence to the next. Not a word, not even a thought. A lot of this is simply, you can hear the agony of the person saying, my name is Pascal, what do I say next? I'm a member of the accounting department, I work here since 6 years. They're just struggling to come up. There's no prior thought to link it all together. And at the novice level, when given the task of, quick, write that list of school supplies that I need to get for you tomorrow, quick, I have to go to the store right now, here's probably what you would have gotten. Here's a classic novice writing sample on demand. Now notice in none of these was there the opportunity to polish it to make it better. So it's still presentational writing, but I simply asked for an on-demand. So I have to make sure then, if I set it up that way, I am conscious of the fact that you could do better given the tools to spell check, to proofread, to have a peer read it and point out things they couldn't understand. It would get better. That's how we can build your performance higher. But in a just on-demand performance, this is what I'm getting. So keeping that in mind and seeing those examples of novice, intermediate, advanced in that presentational mode, I want to now think about how can we again encourage, knowing that that's my learning target, how can we encourage that development in our learners? One of the key things we can do is to make sure that our questions are focused on the function I'm trying to elicit. Because way too often we ask questions that keep our learners at their current level. So here, and you see this, it's right underneath the chart you were looking at, the spiraling of questions to the next level. Here's a classic question that is going to be at the novice level because I'm just going to say, Yes. That's how I'm going to answer the question. There's no need to elaborate. There's no need to tell you more. You ask me this question, I'm going to answer. I may be a really advanced learner, but you asked a novice question, you're going to get a novice answer. So let's start there, but then add another question. So what's it like having an older sister? Okay, I may be still novice, so I want to kind of list, well, she does this, she does this, she does this, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. So it's still that novice following of a pattern, but you're treating me and training me to start to think more like an intermediate. Look at the other examples that are there. Things that you have in your room, classic list. Describing your room, I start to think about, well, what do I do? How do I use those things? I have to give you a little bit more. I have to elaborate. What sports do you play? Again, I'm going to give you a novice list versus what's a practice like? Oh, now I have to create with language. Again, I may be using some very traditional, very comfortable language that I've memorized, but you're asking me to use it in a new way, to put it together in a new way. That's creating with language. That's pushing me towards intermediate. Knowing my learning target changes what we do in our classrooms. Let's look at how we move from intermediate towards advanced with more open-ended questions, trying to get them to think a little bit more. And one of the key things we said, it's not just organization, it's also about telling a story. So tell me about your daily schedule. I could describe that for you, very intermediate-like, good string of sentences. This says, think like a paragraph. Think like an advanced. Tell me some deeper comparisons. Tell me about what it was like in middle school and how it's different in the high school. Same with this example about your job. This is simply asking for intermediate level responses versus now I have to tell you all those steps. I have to think through it. I have to organize it and say, well, first, then, next. Oh, and don't forget to. I mean, all of those things are those kind of markers that we were seeing in that advanced level writing. And the last example here, tell me about your favorite type of movies or theater shows. Oh, I really like blah, 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 blah. Thank you, intermediate. Here it says, tell me a story. Oh, you want me to be advanced, don't you? Okay, I can do that. I can act like an advanced. Because you've given me the help. You've told me what it is. We've practiced what it takes. Now I can do it. I can get there. So as you think again about kind of summarizing, and this is an activity you might want to do in more detail as you look at the can-do statements, try to take some notes about what does it take to move from novice to intermediate. And I put this at the top of the next page, so it may be 4 or 5, depending on how yours printed out, how we can use the can-do statements to compare the two levels. And here are some of the key things that struck me to move from novice to intermediate. We've talked about a lot of these things already, so I don't need to go through the list as you're looking at it. But again, the activity is to look at those can-do statements, compare the novice to the intermediate, and say, if I want to get my students out of novice, what do I have to work on? And make these your learning targets then. And practice them, develop the language, give them the skills they need. It's not that I'm not learning vocabulary or not learning functions or not practicing language. It's that I'm doing it purposefully now. And I know that what they are learning and memorizing and practicing is what's going to move them to the next level. The same with this list you're looking at in your handout, what it takes to move from intermediate to advanced. We saw it in the questions we were asking about telling me more, expanding your details, organizing it, putting things together, giving reasons for your opinions. And that last one is absolutely critical. The learner is doing things more spontaneously, more independently, less is it directed by the teacher. So keeping all of those things in mind, I just want to share with you that this is what has really influenced our design of the Apple assessment, because it's all based on those same strategies. You can go in and look at the demo, and I want you to look at the demo at apple.axel.org simply as a way to expand your thinking about the kinds of tasks that would follow for an assessment if I'm thinking about learning targets this way. Obviously, if my learning target is all about this performance in the 3 modes, I'm not going to go back to saying, would you please just fill in the blanks? It's like, well, why would I go back to just that learning of the little piece? Don't you want me to do something with it? That's what we've been working on for these 3 weeks of the unit. And you can look at it by mode and by level. Form A is novice and intermediate. Form B is intermediate and advanced. So choose what you'd like to look at. Just explore, look through. We've actually added Portuguese to this list, and other languages are always in our planning pipeline. So stay tuned. What I also like about the way that the Apple is set up is the way that the feedback is given. And again, I just want to share this as an example of what you can be doing. You can, first of all, download the entire set of descriptions. But notice how it says, well, what you did in that interpersonal task got you an N4, or that's a novice high. That means you can do these kinds of things. Do you want to get better? Here are some strategies. Here are some things you can work on. That's just like that list we were looking at. What does it take to move from novice to intermediate? Some of the things you see here are exactly what we have on the chart in your handout. The one below it is for intermediate low. It's an I1. So your interpersonal score of I1 means you can do these things. But if you want to get to that next level, this is what you better really be thinking about trying to do more and more in class as you practice. So we're close to summing up here, and I just want to share that here's one of the key things that we think about. Perfection is not the goal, because that's a lifelong destination. I'm still working on that in English. But it's really about, with what this sort of partial control I have of language, can you push me? Can you kind of check where I am and push and probe to get me further? Because that's how I'm going to start to get full control. As I stretch to move into the novice, into the intermediate level, I'm going to gain full control of what is novice. And as I'm in that intermediate level and you're pushing me towards the advanced, I'm going to get stronger and stronger full control of intermediate then. As you push me to the next level, I'm going to get full control of the level that I'm leaving. And again, some of the key things that you saw were critical to move forward. That list is also in your handout. So let me just spend a couple of minutes, if I may, to close out with, let's bring this back to our learning experience and what it takes to get there. And for this, I'm just going to pull one of the units from the Keys to Planning for Learning, the one about, again, where we started, school and education. But notice the essential question is far from simply a random list of vocabulary and questions I might ask about school. Each one of the goals has such richness to it that I could use that for an interpersonal task, I could use it for an interpretive task, I could use it for a presentational task. And you do have this in your handout as well, so you can refer back to those goals. I want to take us to the tasks, since we're all about learning targets. So when I know that my learning target is moving you from novice mid to novice high, and your brains are not novice, your brains are high school brains, I want to treat you like those adolescents that you are and not make you just do a simple tour of the school. It's like, well, let's talk about a deep issue related to school. So here are some examples of how we might work towards these kinds of summative assessment that you see in your handout. It's doing things like this. As we're reading an article, I'm giving the students a frame like this, a graphic organizer, because it'd be too hard for them to make all these inferences and pull all of the information out just if I said, here, read this and then answer 10 questions. If I give them this little chart, they're saying, oh, I want to read and try to see if I can figure out who attends schools. Is it more males or is it more females? Thank you, teacher, for giving me a focus here. So the school schedule, as you're reading this article, see if you can figure out, do we attend more days than the U.S. or fewer days than the U.S.? Think about, can you find out the answers to these questions? This is simply giving novices some help so that they can read those authentic resources and get out of it what a novice should be able to get out of it. And again, not be distracted by all the other language in the article. Here's another example. Let's go to 2 school websites and see what are some similarities or differences. Right away, they're familiar with the genre of websites, so they're going to be able very easily to pull that information out. I'm just giving them the support. Here's another example. Well, as we do this next, we're going to listen to this interview. What do you think might be some reasons why young people can't go to school? Okay, let's see. Was this article or this video clip that we're listening to, did they really mention anything about that? Check, check, check. Some 3 maybe they did, 3 they didn't. Well, if you checked it, write some notes down. What's the information you were able to find out? And this is where it's simply a way of really training our learners to use their novice level strategies, but to get much deeper into an understanding. Let me just end with a couple of examples in the other modes. This is one from presentational, where it talks about how we help them build their language to get to that more advanced level. As I look at each one of these questions, I know my beginning students could give an answer to where, with whom, when, at what time. Maybe why is kind of a challenge. but we're simply saying, please give an answer to each one of those questions, and you will have created a sentence that might confuse me to think that you're pretty much at a high intermediate, even advanced level, because that's a pretty complex sentence. Way to go. And maybe then I simply ask my learners, would you at least just add in one answer to one of the sentences before you turn in your homework? Here's another example. When we say write 5 sentences about school attendance issues, we're going to get something like this, a good intermediate string of sentences again. If I say, would you glue some of your ideas together with some good connecting words so I can see the relationship with these ideas you've randomly put down here? Oh, sure, I can do that. I can put it into 2 sentences. Pretty impressive. I'm acting more like an advanced, and you're training me into what it takes to get there. Critical things to try to do. And one last graphic organizer, again, inferencing is really hard, but if I simply give you the inference and have you look for evidence that either says it's real or it's not real, I have the proof for it or the proof against it, now you're again giving me the kind of guidance I need to be able to pull this off. What I think we've done really carefully is identify that these things belong in the toolbox. These are not the end goals of my learning targets. These are not the end goals of my unit of instruction. So I encourage you on your own to do that last page, that last activity, where many of the tasks in some integrated assessments for an end of a unit, these came from some real teachers I worked with recently. They're targeting different levels. I just pulled the intermediate one here to show you. And to start to go back and look at some of those can-do statements, get really familiar with that particular that particular document, and see if you can find evidence of those from those can-do statements that these are supplying really solid learning performance from your learners. We're all about moving into these new literacies, and so I would just like us to think about it's not just speaking, listening, reading, writing, vocab, and grammar anymore. Look at the very active 21st century skills that we're working on. And if you'd like to continue this conversation, this is a very sincere invitation to join this literacy project that we have. We have a year to set up the infrastructure, and then we can sustain it forever. We invite you to join with other colleagues who are really interested in doing some of the work we've been describing this evening, which is setting learning targets, but within the back of our minds, that idea of literacy, moving performance to the next level, being authentic. So create your own team. Decide how you might end up going about exploring a particular question, and we are going to support you with some free webinars, some resources, a help desk, and connect you with all the other teams that are doing this. So with that, I think that we have done a pretty good job of covering our can-do statements. I think that you have been thinking about all of these, and I hope that at the end of this hour you're going to say, I think I do have more information, more skill than I did an hour ago to be able to say I can do these things. So I'm just going to leave you with one final question that really focuses on that idea of authentic, and I hope you continue to think about how you might use those can-do statements to inform instruction, provide better evidence of learning, all in the name of having clear learning targets. Ken, I turn it back to you. Thank you so very, very much.
Paul, wonderful presentation as always. It's always a pleasure to work with you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are in the audience, now is your time to send in your specific questions to Paul Sandrock, Director of Education for ACTFL. Questions on anything that he spoke about tonight, please send them along in the question area of the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and we are at the 8 o'clock hour, but we'll go over for a few minutes and take a couple of questions, and we invite you to stick around as long as you're able to. Paul, we did have a question regarding the Apple tasks and topics. This person wrote, in looking at the Apple tasks and topics, they change each year. Should this list drive the curriculum?
I would hope it does not drive the curriculum. The tasks actually come from conversations with teachers, and the topics as well. And they try to be generic. And again, like in any sort of outside of the curriculum assessment, if I totally don't know a particular topic, it isn't that I must be at novice low. It's simply you're given opportunities, and it's as you respond and are able to answer at given an intermediate opportunity, could you come up with any kind of intermediate language? So I think instead of looking at the topics as a must-do in my curriculum, it may be a way of saying, well, it's kinds of tasks and kinds of things to talk about on these kinds of topics. I think I would practice more the tasks that are going to allow someone to show, if I'm trying to show good, not solid novice language or intermediate or advanced language, would be my advice, is going to serve you more, because otherwise you're just trying to second guess. I would practice the tasks, since it is a performance assessment. I think would make your students much more confident, even if it's a topic that they're not super familiar with.
Great, thank you, Paul. Another question came in earlier on. The question was, can you provide some examples of proficiency-based assessments that teachers can utilize in a classroom setting to serve as benchmarks to measure growth based on the proficiency levels and goals? And immediately after this person asked that question, you went into some of the assessments generically that you thought might support that part of the conversation. So I wrote this person back and said, is Paul answering your question? And she says, generally, and I said, well, what question can I really ask him to maybe dig a little bit deeper? And so this person wanted to know more about, she said, I'm thinking in terms of summative assessments and non-rehearsed situations. So I guess that's kind of the question. Can you provide some proficiency-based examples of proficiency-based assessments that are summative and non-rehearsed that teachers can utilize in a classroom setting? Make sense?
Absolutely.
Great.
It absolutely does. Absolutely does. So the only guarantee that I'm absolutely at a proficiency level is to do a proficiency assessment. But we know the oral proficiency interview, the writing proficiency test is not something that we're probably going to have all of our K-12 learners do. I need it for my teacher certification. That's a different thing. So what we try to do is proficiency-like assessments in my classroom. And that's where that backward design and the link with of the can-do statements, I think, is really that's sort of like the translation document for me, because it has the proficiency target, but it says, and what does that look like in performance terms? And again, I think we always have to create the context within which I'm going to be practicing and rehearsing the language I need and the types of tasks that you want me to do, but I will not have memorized the summative task, if that makes some sense. So as I look on the last page of the handout that I sent also, all of those were examples of assessments that teachers would have prepared their students for through the various tasks, the various topics, the various things done throughout the course of a unit. See the first one kind of about holidays, the middle one about immigration and family background, the last one about changing responsibilities and how their family responsibilities are different in cultures. We would have worked a lot of time to really develop my repertoire to talk about, to read about, to write about all those various topics, but I haven't exactly done it in this way. I haven't done it exactly this way, so it's not just a rehearsed, memorized, canned, oh, here it is, given it to you. So the interpretive, I've done things like that. The interpersonal, I've done things like that, but not exactly that particular one. These presentational, because they have PowerPoints and videos, tend to be more the project type presentational, but they don't always have to be. As I said, sometimes our presentational is more of an on-demand. But then I have to make sure in my rubric I honor that and say the language probably won't be as good because you didn't have time to do that organizing and proofing and everything. I just tried to get the raw ideas down, more like a journal entry rather than a letter to the editor. The journal entry is the on-demand. The letter to the editor would be the rehearsed, practiced, polished version of a presentational.
Thank you for that thoughtful response. We do have a question from the audience. Do you feel there is any value in doing cloze exercises? If so, where would you implement them? And if not, why not?
So those I always find tricky because often we expect they're going to be able to fill in all the blanks. It may be a way to check, do you have vocabulary? And how much vocabulary do you remember? Unless I provide the word bank to use. I've seen it done that way as well. Then it becomes really a vocabulary exercise. Can you apply the vocabulary in a contextualized meaning? So it would have value in that. To me, it's not the summative assessment because that's not authentic. That's not anything I ever do in my day-to-day life. I haven't just been given a script where I had to fill in blanks with words that came to my head. If I do it in the way without a word bank, it's important that I realize that you're probably not going to get them all. And even a really good, thoughtful person would have difficulty matching exactly what was in the original, because it shows that there's a variety of vocabulary, there are a variety of possibilities. So use it thoughtfully, use it carefully. To me, it's more of a practice tool. It's probably not my end of unit assessment tool. Again, to me, it doesn't quite meet the authentic test.
Thank you, Paul. We do have a question about can-do statements now. When planning a particular lesson, can one lesson have can-do statements that touch on all the modes of communication, or would it be best to stick to one mode per lesson?
Lesson or unit?
This person put down lesson.
Okay, so lesson is a single day in my sense, and a lesson may focus on a particular mode. It doesn't mean that I totally eliminate the other modes, but my focus, what I really am trying to improve and work on in that day, might be a single mode. We're really spending time today on, let's say it's an interpretive task. We may have done some warm-up interpersonally. We may have an exit ticket, which is a presentational writing on-demand task. But in the meantime, my main learning target might have been at that lesson level, one mode. I would make sure that over the course of a unit, I have good balance. Even if it's not raising the level in a mode super, I'm not making huge jumps maybe in one of the modes during one particular unit, but at least I want to make sure that I sort of keep a steady rhythm of all three. Otherwise, they fade really quickly. It's like basketball practice. If I don't practice all the various kind of shots that I need, when I need it, it won't be there. And so I have to make sure that we practice all of them, even if I really focus on some more than others. So I think it's a question of balance. But at a unit level, I really like the idea of making sure that there's some summative evidence that at least touches on all three modes.
Thank you, Paul. Another question about Apple, and we are coming to the close of this webinar with just a few more questions. So in the Apple, the feedback is fantastic for how students are able to proceed. The question is, how are multiple choice reading questions aligned with their proficiency?
Sure. So there's always a task and text correlation. Again, the whole Apple is designed around the idea of you're given an opportunity to show novice language, to show intermediate language, to show advanced level language, or to be able to, in the interpretive mode, get to that level of understanding, that depth. So it's the way that the task is set up, the questions are asked in interpersonal, the text that is given. So a lot of the limiting is done through that aligning of what is asked and what all is part of the prompt. Given that opportunity, the way that the rating happens then is given the opportunity, let's say, to respond to some questions in the interpersonal conversation, the simulated conversation, if that were in the intermediate mode, in intermediate range, there are two quick questions that the human rater has to answer. Number one, this was an intermediate opportunity. Did you respond with intermediate language? You say yes or no. Like, no, that was not intermediate language. Or yes, it was intermediate language. If I say yes, the person responded with intermediate language, I then say, was it strong or was it weak? And if I say no, it was not intermediate language, then it's like, well, was there any evidence of intermediate? You say, okay, I heard one sentence. And those various ratings over each time the student is given an intermediate opportunity to come up with intermediate language, an advanced to come up with advanced language, or the novice to come up with novice language, it is putting all of those individual ratings together, because as I said in that pyramid, the one you're looking at your screen, to be at the novice mid, I have to have at least some little inklings of intermediateness. To be at novice high, I have to have more inklings, more evidence of intermediate. And to be at the intermediate, I have to have very little evidence of, given the intermediate opportunity, you still came back with novice, right? So that's how it works. And in the interpretive, it's all about the kinds of questions, the difficulty of accessing the text is all analyzed to make sure that the correlation, again, of the level and the task match.
Paul, on behalf of everybody in the webinar this evening, and we have people from Canada who are with us this evening as well, and all across the country, please let me say on behalf of them, thank you so very much for taking time out of your personal and professional life. We know you're in Atlanta, Georgia tonight on work business, and we just are so thankful for your time in sharing all of these wonderful resources and high quality professional development with us. You're an amazing individual, and we're just so thankful. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. This is great, and I appreciate the questions. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Paul, for that very informative presentation. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, it has been recorded. And the recording of this webinar will be made available on the NYSAFLT website in the coming days. Because it was a free webinar, we will be offering the video recording for free on the NYSAFLT website via a link to YouTube. Please pay attention to your email for additional details that we'll be sending out to you so that you can access this video on demand at any time, and you can share it with your colleagues as well. If you have a particular topic that you'd like to see presented, or you know of a colleague who NYSAFLT should approach about presenting a webinar, please let us know via email at webinars@nysaflt.org. And if you have any questions at all after today regarding our organization or our service, please contact us at webinars@nysaflt.org. Someone from NYSAFLT will be sure to answer your question. This is our final webinar for the 2014-2015 school year. Thank you so much, very much for attending. And on behalf of the NYSAFLT Professional Development Committee, thank you so much for your support of our professional development endeavors. Have a great night, everybody, and goodbye.